Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Findmypast Live. My name is Ellie. I run social media for Findmypast. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is a beautiful day, and it's made even more fantastic by the fact that I'm not alone today. I have a guest, which is amazing. Please allow me to introduce Melanie Backe-Hansen. She is a researcher and historian and an author to boot, and she is going to be our very special guest today. So thank you so much for joining us, Melanie.
Oh, thank you.
Brilliant. Now I'm just going to make sure I've got all my comments and all my notes up, and we'll say hello to people as well.
Right.
So let's make sure I've got all of that ready, and then we will get started talking about some house history, which I am really excited about. Okay, so let's open this up. Brilliant. So yeah, we've already got our first viewers. We've got Linda, we've got Kim, we've got Steve, Rosie, Julie, Liz, Elaine. Although it is 11 a.m. here in Massachusetts. Thank you for joining us all the way from the USA, Elaine. That's fantastic. We've got Dee as well. Lovely. So we've got a good number of viewers. So I think we will get started. So today as I said, we've got a very special guest, and if you are resident in the UK and you've noticed, there's a new show that started on BBC Two, season 3 of A House Through Time. It's one of my personal favourites. I can't get through a single episode without either almost bursting into tears or actually bursting into tears. I don't know about you, Melanie, but I just find it so emotional.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. There's always so many personal stories, and the team are actually quite good at pulling out those stories. But actually, they're pinpointing very personal life stories that generations of people went through. So I think it's when you actually get to know their stories, and you get to know a bit about who they were, and then you hear of some sort of tragic circumstances. It's both interesting but also very upsetting. So I think you're not alone. A lot of other people get a bit weepy, and
it's just sort of when you get that sort of, I've even got goosebumps now, even just thinking about it. I'm not even watching it. I don't know if the rest of you guys watching at home feel the same way. Did you manage to catch the episode? If you're in the UK, remember you can always watch it back on iPlayer if you didn't manage to catch it. In fact, I want to go back and rewatch it because I think we got quite into the live tweeting, didn't we, Melanie?
Yes, I know. I was saying that to some people as well, because actually we were tweeting so much and everyone was chatting about it that I missed a bit, and I have to go back and watch it myself. So.
Yeah, we've got some other people joining us as well. So we've got Audrey, we've got Michelle, Mandy, Hilary, Pam, Maria, Paul, Deborah, Ellen, Christine. Got lots of people. Brilliant. Nice. Oh, I'm so excited. So I just want to, in case our viewers are not aware of what Melanie does, I just wanted to have a quick look at your biography and just let our viewers know what you're about and what you do for a living. So Melanie's an independent historian. She's a writer, she's a speaker, and she specialises in the social history of houses across the United Kingdom. And the main focus of her original research is for homeowners and corporate clients, and she provides bespoke house history books and research reports. So she's got an incredible CV. Let's put it that way. She's a research consultant on A House Through Time on BBC Two. And she's also written a book with David Olusoga as well, and that is out now.
Yes.
And we do actually have a copy of it to give away as a prize. Yes. So thank you so much, Melanie, for providing that. We're going to be announcing the winner of that giveaway a little bit later on. So if you have entered, do stay tuned to see if you are the lucky winner. Melanie has also written other books as well. We'll go into those in a little bit more detail in a moment, because I've got a couple of questions for Melanie just so you can get to know her a little bit better. And she's also a writer for national media, lifestyle magazines. She appears on TV, radio, online media. Just a fantastic CV. And what I quite liked about it as well is that at the time, you were the first and only historian to be employed by a UK estate agent to research the history of houses and streets. I mean, how cool is that?
I know, it was quite a dream job. Yeah. Yeah.
I think a lot of our viewers will be thinking that as well. And it does sound like a dream job.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of our viewers maybe join us for the family history aspect, but I'm sure a lot of you watching are interested in house history as well, because I think the two often go hand in hand.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Excellent. So just to let you guys at home know what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be interviewing Melanie briefly, first of all, about house history, about her career, about her role on A House Through Time. We're also going to be answering some of your pre-submitted questions, and if you have any questions now, get them into the comments and we will try and get to as many as we can. So yeah, get those into the comments. And as I said, we are going to be announcing the giveaway winner, which is really exciting. I already know who they are. I can't blurt it out yet. What a shame. So yeah, so what we'll do is I think we'll crack on with sort of the interview section of this session, if that's all right, Melanie.
Yeah.
So what I thought, so our lovely community members can get to know you a little bit better, I thought we could play two truths and a lie. So you could tell us two things that are true about yourself, one lie, and we have to guess. So everybody in the comments guessing, we have to guess which one is the lie. So over to you.
Okay, well, hopefully they're not too tricky. Some people might pick them up very quickly, but okay, the first fact, or not, is that I grew up in Australia. The second is I have lived in Oxford, England. And the third, I have been skydiving.
Skydiving? I'll ask you this afterwards. So yeah, which one do we think is the lie? So grew up in Australia, lived in Oxford, been skydiving. Everybody in the comments, go. Which one is the lie? William, you don't win anything, I'm afraid, other than eternal glory and bragging rights on this occasion.
For being very clever.
Anybody wants to take a guess? I can't guess because I know.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, I think they're so busy chatting about how amazing that the program is, and about how interesting house history is in general. Okay, so Mike says Oxford is the lie. Daphne thinks Australia. Mandy thinks Oxford. Fiona thinks Oxford. So did Dee, Jackie, Amanda. Ellen thinks it's Australia, and Lorraine thinks it's skydiving. Okay, so Melanie, could you reveal which one is the lie?
Okay, the lie is that I lived in Oxford. So I think most people got that. Although I have lived in Cambridge, which is why I thought it was quite clever. But yes, I have never actually resided in Oxford. So, but the rest is all true. I grew up in Australia. I went skydiving on my 21st birthday, which was brilliant. I would do it again in a second. So
that was going to be my question. Would you do it again? Have you done it again?
Yeah, I'd love to. But I was in Australia at the time, and it seemed quite simple when you're 21 to just, grab a group of friends and go. But you haven't done it again. So we'll, watch this space.
Let us know. Okay, let's get into the nitty gritty now. So I do have a couple of questions for you, and I hope it answers, if perhaps you at home may be too shy to ask a question, I hope this will answer your questions. So first of all, I just wanted to ask, how did you become a specialist house historian? What drew you to this quite niche aspect of history?
Yes, well, it was kind of an accident. Obviously, I studied history at university. I loved history, and actually sort of a love of history runs in my family. So my mum has done a PhD in ancient history, and my brother's been on archaeological digs and all sorts. So we've always had a passion for history. But when I graduated, it was very much a case of not really knowing what to do. Like most graduates, you're a bit stuck. So I actually went into publishing for many years in marketing and PR. But several years later, I was living in England and looking for a new opportunity, and it was an advertisement for a historical researcher, but with marketing and PR experience. So it was this very odd combination of skills. And as it turned out, it was the estate agent. And that, yeah, which was very unusual, because actually when I went for the interview, they still didn't tell me what industry it was for. They wanted to keep it top secret from their competitors. And but yes, so I was employed as an in-house historian, purely to research the history of the houses that were on the market. So that's how it sort of kick-started. So I had the love of history already. And actually, when I first moved to England, you know, obviously coming from Australia, which is a much younger country, I would always look up at buildings as well. I was always, you know, wandering streets and looking up at houses and wondering what they were like when they were first built and what sort of people would have lived in them. And so actually it was this great, fortuitous plan that I came to have this role. And ever since, I've absolutely loved it and adored it. And, you know, I've been freelance now for actually 8 years. Actually, I think it's a bit longer than that, but a little over 8 years. And I still love it, still, you know, researching houses all over the country. So that's kind of how it happened, and I've just gone with it. So it's great.
Brilliant. And I think this will resonate with a lot of you at home as well, about how if we're walking down a street, we do look at the architecture around us, we look at the houses, we look at the streets. And me personally, I love looking at old buildings, and I love seeing sometimes when you've got the engraving of when the house was built. I'm transported back in time.
Yes.
I just love that.
Yeah, well, that's it, exactly. Yeah, I think my first jobs was in Covent Garden, which is like prime, you know, London history world, you know, and I would always walk through the streets wondering about these amazing houses. So yeah.
Fantastic. So my next question is, obviously you've got your new book out, A House Through Time, co-authored with David Olusoga. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your books. I mean, you've got a number of them that you've written. It's an incredible achievement, and I'm sure they will be of great interest to our viewers at home as well. So I just wondered if you could maybe tell us a little bit about them.
Yes, the latest book with David is accompanying the new series of A House Through Time. I think you can see it behind me.
Oh, there it is.
But it's we sort of broke up the chapters, and I offer advice on if people are wanting to do their own research. So there's a bit of that in there, a bit of guidance on where to go and what sort of things to see or to look at. But then also we tell the story about the evolution of the urban house and how we've lived in our houses and how our cities have developed and changed ever since it starts with the Romans, but we get into more detail with medieval and Tudor. And then how did we go from Tudor houses with timber frames and jetties, you know, in places like York. And then how did that develop into the sort of classic Georgian terrace and the development of that, and how we've lived in our houses and how different events in history have impacted our lives and the way we've lived. So everything from disease to crime to war, you know, obviously all these different elements of our past have had an impact on our houses and the way we've lived. So we tell that story all the way through to sort of more recent history and you know, everything through post-war, homes for heroes, you know, council housing and how that's changed in the 20th century, and then post-Second World War, the impact of the Blitz and the bombing in different cities. And so it's a real sort of journey through our urban houses. So I hope people will love it, actually, because I think it really is, there's loads of information there that people will sort of, it's the sort of thing that people wonder about, or, you know, they'll look at a house and think, well, why did that happen? And hopefully all the answers are in the book. My other books, which again, you can just see behind me. But my first one was House Histories, which actually tells the stories of lots of different houses. So it's small houses, big houses, some well-known, but on the whole, they're lesser known cottages, terraced houses, all mixture of different places across the country, and revealing some of those stories. So it's hopefully, it's like A House Through Time, but lots of different houses. So it's telling the stories, the sort of people that lived in them, some of them a few scandals, a few dramas, and so it's lots of different houses. So it's quite nice. People have told me it's a good one to sort of pick up and read a bit there, because you can read different stories and you can flip through, and it's a good mixture of lots of different types of houses. And then the third book, or the second one I wrote, Historic Streets and Squares, it tells the story of largely well-known locations across the UK, and how they became the well-known locations we know. So that's everything from Portobello Road in London to Queen Square in Bristol to Steep Hill in York, sorry, not York, Lincoln. But it's lots of different places, and it is, as it says, streets and squares. So it's some of those prominent squares that you might know about in different cities across the country. But then, a range of different streets, tiny streets, the medieval street in a place called Castle Combe in the Cotswolds. And so it's a real mixture in how they became either very popular, tourist attractions, or they gained a famous name. So that's kind of a run through of all my books.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully one of you watching will be in with a chance to win a copy of Melanie's most recent book. Stay tuned, as I said, to find out who has won that. Let's have a quick look in the comments, and we'll see what's going on here before we carry on. We do have Niall in the comments today, so if you do have any questions that maybe aren't for Melanie, just pop them in the comments. Niall is on hand to help with those. Lovely, and you're all chatting amongst yourselves, so that's good. I will get to live questions later on, so keep popping them into the comments, and we'll come to those in a bit. So a couple more questions for you, Melanie, then. So as I said, that you are a researcher for A House Through Time, and I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about what that role involves.
Yes, well, it's quite a treat, I have to say. I was contacted actually several years ago when they were in development. Actually, they'd come up with the idea of this program, but it was very much a case of, well, will this work, and how does it work? What's involved with researching the history of a house? So I was brought in to sort of advise on that, and to show some of the ways that you can uncover stories and what's involved and how you piece together the different sources. And then from there, I was involved in helping with some of the research challenges, and particularly in the early stages of the story of the house. So quite often I was asked to look through the deeds that sort of revealed the very first stages of its story. Unraveling the deeds, which can be quite complicated, and actually piecing together some of the key elements, and in some cases actually making sure that we were researching the right house, because the house in Newcastle was a prime example where the house name, so the house number changed, and actually in some of the early records it wasn't clearly identified at all. And that's very common actually with house histories. It's some of the early records, the houses themselves aren't clearly identified, that perhaps the owner is, or perhaps the occupant. But so I was brought in to sort of help decipher some of the deeds and answer a few questions. And in the most recent series, if people have caught the first episode, I was brought in again to help with the deeds and help to piece together the early history of Guinea Street, and also the first owner and the first occupant. And that was largely through the land tax. So fortunately, Bristol actually have an amazing land tax collection, which goes right back to the early 1700s, at the time the house was built. But again, the properties aren't clearly identified. So it's a very much sort of methodical process, going through the documents, working out who was who and who was where and what was going on. So I helped the team sort of decipher the land tax and what that told us about not only when the house was built, but who built it or who's responsible, and then what that meant for them as a person. So what that meant for Captain Saunders, and basically his wealth in the fact that he was able to actually build several properties in Guinea Street. And then that sort of springboards the team into unraveling more questions and doing more research and taking the journey further. So yeah, that's kind of my key role.
As I've said, I think a lot of you at home will be thinking this sounds like a dream job, but also the fact that, you know, some of the houses change numbers and you're not sure you have the right house. I think a lot of us can sympathise when we're not sure we have the right ancestor, or they've changed their name, or they've not put down maybe the right date of birth on a census record, for example. So I think a lot of us can sympathise, and the skills can be used across both areas.
Oh yeah, very much.
Brilliant. So the last question I've got for you before we move on to our community questions, I wondered whether you could tell us something that we might not know about your profession, or maybe something that's been unexpected for you.
Right, yeah. I found this question quite tricky, but actually, if I'm perfectly honest, it was the fact that you could find out so much. I think when I first started, it was this particular field, or this particular area was relatively new, although I'd done historic research and this kind of thing before. But actually we're genuinely blessed in the UK. I think there are so many documents which can reveal so much of the story, not only of the house itself, but then the people within it. And I think that's where there's a nice crossover into family history, because it's unraveling those people stories. And a lot of the time it's people who are not necessarily remembered in history books. You know, it's the lower classes, or it's those who are just, you know, they got on with life and they didn't do anything super famous, or perhaps they were women or children and they're just not recorded. And so actually one of the best things, or one of the most surprising things, was actually there's a wealth of information you can find. It might take a bit of detective work, it might take a bit of digging and delving, but actually there's loads you can find. And I think that's something to take away, that actually, yes, there are some challenges and some brick walls, but you can find loads of information.
Absolutely. And I think that story aspect of finding people who wouldn't normally be in the history books, I just think that's wonderful. And you know, I won't spoil too much in case anybody hasn't watched Tuesday night's episode yet, but the real human stories that the team unearthed were just incredible. And again, I get quite emotional just thinking about them. And it's the same with our ancestors. A lot of these people weren't recorded in history books, but we're remembering them and we're honouring them now by just bringing their past to life a little bit, which is nice. Okay, so that's all of my questions. We did have a couple of pre-submitted ones, so thank you to everybody who took the time to put in a question ahead of time. So I'm just we'll go through those and then we'll do some live ones. So Kelly says, I'm new to all of this, so this may be a basic question. I'm looking for information on a street in the Welsh valleys. A lot of my relatives all lived in the same street, typical miners' terraces. I wondered more about when the street was built, maybe by who, where is the best place to head for this information? And she says, thank you in advance with a thumbs up emoji.
Well, this probably the best thing basically is looking at the history of the village or the town, and it's looking at the local history. And actually there may be, so especially at the moment when archives are closed, there might be several sort of local history, county histories online. But actually when I'm starting my research, this is where I would go. And actually you might find clues as to you know, the development of the town, when it expanded, perhaps a few clues about the mines, and perhaps the landowners or the mine owners, and what that might tell you about the development of different streets and different locations. That's probably the best thing to do, because you can piece together quite a few key elements. And then from there, you can start delving a bit further. So if it was a particular landowner, perhaps there's a collection in the local archives, which comes, you know, in particularly in sort of pre-20th century, although it still applied then. But in a lot of cases, large landowners, they owned lots of areas. So it might have been a lord of the manor, or it might have been a sort of a separate landowner, and they might have been responsible for building or paying for the building of several streets and loads of houses. And so that will reveal some of the story. So that's probably the best thing to do is to look into the local history. The local archives or the record office will have loads of sources for that. But also if there's a local history society, they might have their own sources or articles that people have written about different areas. And there might actually be someone who's already done a bit of delving and already come up with, you know, the key elements of this street was built at this time and the houses were built by these people. So you just never know. So that will give people, a few places to then go from there.
Lovely. Thank you, Melanie. And thank you, Kelly, for your question. That was a really good question. And hopefully that will maybe answer, you've answered that quite broadly, which is good because it will apply to lots of other people's research as well. So thank you. So the next question we've got is from Alistair. And he says, hi there, I really enjoyed A House Through Time on Tuesday. Really interesting programme. I'd like to ask what your top 3 recommended sources are for beginners interested in researching their properties past, please. And he says thank you in advance.
Okay, well the top, again, I would go to local history. That would be my top thing. I would also look at maps, and actually, again, while we're on lockdown, maps are increasingly becoming available online. So there's loads of different sources in different locations. The Ordnance Survey Map is a good place to go first. They were produced sort of in detail periodically from about the 1860s, 1870s, depends on where you are. And then every sort of 20 or 30 years, they produced another one. So you might have 1860s, then you might have 1880s, then you might have 1910. And actually, they're brilliant because they actually show that development, particularly from the 19th century, Victorian period, and then the expansion of towns and how they changed. And you might discover that actually in the 1880s or even 1860s, the whole area was fields, and actually that will also help you identify perhaps when your house was built, because if you know maybe it's Victorian but it's not on the 1860s map, but then it does appear on the 1880s map, you can kind of narrow down the likely construction time, construction date. But also it gives you a picture of the whole area and how it's developed. So whether you're in an urban location or country, it can show you the surrounding changes. It can also identify perhaps street name changes. So you might discover your location and find the street name was different to what it is now. So there's all sorts of clues, and maps are a great one. And they'll, as I say, Ordnance Survey Map, you can go to National Library of Scotland, and they will have a lot of the Ordnance Survey maps for the whole country, not just Scotland. But it's a really good, easy map search as well. So you can actually just sort of zoom into your location, which is helpful. But there's all sorts of other maps as well that can give you clues. So if you do a bit of searching around online, again, depending on which part of the country you're in, but that's another top tip. Probably say, I would normally say census records, but so Findmypast obviously have all those census records, so you can search those by address. Searching by address can be a bit tricky, just because in some cases the address wasn't even listed on the original document. So if you're trying to search, so sometimes you might have to sort of delve down through the search function by location and then parish, and that will help you find. But otherwise, I would also say newspapers. They're really a wealth of information. And that can include advertisements for the house. So it might be a room for rent, or it could be the whole house for sale. Also, it tells you stories about the people. So you might find stories of former residents who either were, could have been the lady of the house who was hiring a new lady's maid, or it could be someone who got in trouble with the law and they're, up against the magistrate, or they're in court for something. There's all sorts of things. There's announcements for engagements and births, and so newspapers can be really helpful, at least as well, to personalize it. Because I think some of the official records, they just list the head of the house and very little else. So newspapers are good for personalizing the stories.
Yeah, those are some brilliant resources. Personally, for the census records, my youngest sister lived on a well-known street in Liverpool. I can't remember which street it was, but we stayed up until must have been about 2 in the morning one night, researching the history of her house. using census records. And then we found advertisements in the newspapers, because it changed its function over the years. So at one point it was a boarding house, and then it was linked with, I think, the church that was nearby. And
right, wow, yeah, that's I mean, anyone who's watched A House Through Time will see that. And I think David often refers to, you know, the not only older people, you know, that's another key thing about census for house histories, is some records they just have the head of the house, but actually the census has got everyone in the house. So that's children, servants, lodgers, boarders, the whole deal. And that's, that comes through, you know, where there's a lodging house or it's divided up, it might have been apartments at some stage, and you can see all the different households. So yeah, it could keep you occupied for quite some time.
Exactly. And just going back to your maps as well, we've got on Findmypast the 1939 registered map search, which yes is brilliant for finding who lived in your house in 1939, or just finding who lived in a house in general. What I really like to use it for, as you said, is seeing how an area changed over time, because you can swap it from a modern day map, so a map from the 1930s, 1940s, and then to a map from the 1880s.
Right.
So you can see how the area, from my hometown in particular, the area sort of just sprawls over the course of the centuries. Yeah,
I know that's the great thing about maps, because it's that visual source, I guess, you know, because sometimes if it's a whole list of names, it doesn't bring it alive so much perhaps, but if you've got that visual image and you've got a couple of little streets, or particularly some rural locations which literally were a tiny village, and then 50 years later it's like boom, you know, like it's a massive explosion of new streets and houses. And there's actually, I use a map when I'm researching Kensington in London, and it's this key point where it shows the parish of Kensington before the tube or the underground goes through. And so it's literally market gardens, it's fields, there's a couple of streets and houses. And then 30 years later, the tube has come, or the underground has come through, the district line came through Kensington, and the whole area is covered. But it's literally in a period of like 25, 30 years, it goes from fields to completely covered in. It's just such a dramatic image. Yeah. So
I'm picturing that now.
That's good.
So we've got a couple more pre-submitted questions, and then we'll go on to the live questions. So keep popping them in the comments if you do you'd like Melanie to answer your question. So the next one we've got is from Nicola, and she says, when you're asked to research a house's history, what is your starting point?
Well, yeah, I actually, sort of answered this before, but I would genuinely go to the local history. You know, I don't know every single area across the country, so it's very much, you know, if someone gives me, especially actually when I was with the estate agent, but even now, some people will give me an address and I have a few photographs of the house, and sometimes I don't get a chance to go to the house. So it's very much a case of looking at the local history and actually getting an idea of its history and the house's position within the local area. And that is very important, not only to get an idea of how the area's changed and perhaps who the landowner was, but also there's some key elements that will help when you're researching, and that will include perhaps the parish, because a lot of records, as a lot of people will know here, that they're often catalogued by parish, and also different wards, you know, so districts and wards. So if you're looking at things like electoral registers, you need to know which district and ward it's in. So getting an idea of not only the general local history, and perhaps it was a mining town, or perhaps it was just been agricultural for, you know, generations, or perhaps it was impacted by the railways, or perhaps was impacted by war. And so actually those, you know, getting an understanding of the general picture of the area first will help when you're then starting to delve into the specifics of the house.
Of course, yeah. I think what's the well-known phrase? Context is king.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, I usually say location, but you know.
Yeah, that's catchier. We'll go with that. We'll go with location. One more question we've got from Jo, and this probably ties in a little bit to the previous questions, but let's go with it anyway. So she says, Firstly, which sources do you rely on for house history that won't be so familiar to most family historians? And secondly, do you know how many houses were considered in the casting process for this series of A House Through Time?
Yes, okay. Well, the source that perhaps is not so familiar, this is tricky because I quite often think something's not familiar and then everyone goes, yeah, we know about that. But I'd probably say perhaps something like rate books, if people might shoot me down and say they don't know about those, but rate books are essentially before we had council tax, each local area or parish would have had a very array of different rates or taxes, and that was everything from church rates to highway rates to help with the roads to scavenger rates or sewage rates. So it's basically everything that we would pay for now as part of our council tax, but it was divided up differently in sort of in the past. I won't get into all the different dates because it changed. So everything from the poor rate, which is probably the most familiar, some people may have heard of that, and that actually dates right back to Queen Elizabeth I, who first could have introduced some kind of parish help for the poor. But then that changed and developed. So a lot of the rate books, they can vary enormously depending on your location. So some locations you can go right back to the 17th century and they will show you at least the name of the person at the house that was paying the rate. Others might not go back that far and you might have gaps in the records, but the key element is that it is fantastic for filling in the gaps. So especially if you're looking at perhaps census records, or even if you're looking at electoral registers, but not everyone was eligible to vote, so you might have some gaps in the record those ways. So rate books are great for filling in the gaps, and particularly going back into time pre-census. You can look back into the 18th century, and in most places you can get some good records that help piece together who owned the house and who occupied it, and also the value, and that will give you some hints about what kind of house. And if you see some changes in the values as you go through the records, that might give you some hints about perhaps the house changed, or perhaps it was divided up, or perhaps something happened. If it was valued at £40 one year and then it's valued at 100 the next, then clearly something's changed, something's happened. So that will give you clues. So perhaps, I'd probably go with rate books.
Lovely. So rate books, everybody.
Yeah. And what was the second question?
The second question was, do you know how many houses were considered for this series of A House Through Time?
Yes. Now, I don't know exactly. I was brought in the early stages to help, because particularly for this new series, because they went with an older house. So the first two series, the houses were, I think, 1820s and then 1840s, roughly. So in this house, they particularly wanted an 18th century, or certainly an older house. And so they brought me in to help with delving into the pre-19th century records. As far as I understand it, they do start with a list of about 20 or 30, and actually they sort of skim through some early research to get an idea of the likely stories, perhaps the sources that are available, and then they slowly narrow that down into a short list, and then they go from there. And of course, it depends on the owners being willing to be filmed and being a part of the program, and so there's a lot of questions. But yeah, they do actually look into quite a few different houses to narrow the final choice.
That's a lot of work to get one house.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure if you ask the research team, they will they will agree with you enormously. Yeah,
but again, dream job. Dream job indeed, yes. Okay, so the last pre-submitted question we had wasn't necessarily a question, but it was a member of our community called Kim, who we love. Hi Kim, hope you're watching. She just wanted to share some of her tips and advice that she's come across when searching history of a house. So she says, if you're lucky to live in a house built before the 1930s, check the 1939 register. It's a good snapshot of that house during that period in time.
Yep.
She also says, look at old maps, as we've already said, if you live in a new build, because as we've already mentioned, you can look at the area through time without the house being there. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
She also says sometimes old houses were demolished to make way for new ones. They might have been on a farmer's field or part of an old country estate. And her next tip, which I really love this one, I've never really thought of this myself, is find out when the neighbours moved in. Just think outside the box a little bit. Kim says that the house I grew up in was built in the 1960s. We were the third lot of occupants living in there in the early 1980s. And her late neighbour was there from when the house was being built. So ask around if you can.
Yes, yeah. No, that is a very good tip. Yeah, if you can, know people in the street or in the area who've lived in the location for a long time, or it's if they're happy to chat, it depends. Maybe it's at lockdown, it's an excuse to go and be friendly with neighbours at a social distance. But yeah, and local history societies can be good for that as well. But yeah, the other thing I like about the 1939 register is not only is it great because it's filled in a massive gap with the early 20th century, but one of the key things I love is that it will give you, if someone was volunteering with war work, and that is, it's not exactly like a census if people haven't seen it. Most people may have. But it gives you a few key elements, obviously people's names, their birth dates, their occupation. But on the far column, it often gives you voluntary war work, and they could be an ambulance driver, they could be an air raid warden. And actually that I find fascinating, because it's not only does it again provide more personal information about someone, but literally it's the first month of the war. It brings it alive as to, actually, if you look quite often, you get one page of the 1939 register and you see all the people volunteering. And I think it just kind of, you're talking about earlier about getting emotional. And I think that, I think it's really important. And actually you can find out so much and find people's stories that way. So it's a good one.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Okay, are you ready for some live questions, Melanie?
Okay, yes.
Okay. So I just want to say that the way my Facebook is displaying the questions to me, it's only displaying the most recent ones, the most recent 20 or 30. So if you did ask a question right at the beginning, could you repost it, please? Just copy and paste it, because I can't see it at the moment. But I'll just work through a couple of them, and hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. So let's have a look and see what sort of questions we've got here for you. Okay, so I'm just scrolling through. Okay, so Rachel says, one house I'm looking into had the same family living in it for nearly 100 years. What information may be available, and what websites can I look at, please?
Well, yes, I'm just trying to think. Okay, well, obviously Findmypast if you're head there. It depends on what sort of era they're all there, but yes, it's a lot of, if you know from some records that the family's there for that length of time, it is very much about then looking into their personal story, their personal history, and actually you're inevitably going to end up doing more genealogical research and actually looking at the marriages and perhaps the stories of the children. And I'm reminded, actually, I did a house, it was a farmhouse in Somerset, and it was a similar situation where actually it was the same family through 3 generations were farmers at this house, and it was very much telling their stories and who the children married and where they then went on to, and you piece together the story. But what was really nice is that the current owners are friends with the descendants of that family that lived in the house. So they just absolutely loved it, because then they were able to sort of get together with their friends and their neighbours, and actually it had a whole community sense to it, because that family had been in that area for so long, not only in that house but in the actual area. But yeah, that's probably the key thing. Websites, yeah, there's obviously a range of different genealogical ones, Findmypast, but yeah, there's the map one. You can go to online catalogues for that local area as well. Obviously the archives are closed, but another key thing might be go to their online catalogue and do a bit of searching that way, and you might find some records there either for the house or the family. So that's probably while we're in lockdown, sort of play around with some of the catalogue records for the local area, or the National Archives Discovery Catalogue as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so Niall in the comments is being a gem, and he's sending me some of the questions from before, so thank you, Niall. So some of the other questions we've got here, we've got Pam, who says, I stay in a block of flats built in 1905. I can't find who lived in my flat in the census records in Scotland without having a name to search. Is there any way I can overcome this?
Ordinarily, I would say you can look at electoral registers, although yeah, 1905, you might not get everyone. Obviously, not everyone could vote at that point, both men and women, but you can start with electoral registers. Also directories, they're very good for the 20th century, and they may be able to give you at least the head of the house or some details. But also the other thing about that with directories, you perhaps might not find the name of the person in your flat, so to speak, but you might find other names, and then you can use those other names to search the census. So, and then that might lead you to, you know, clues about, you know, who was there when and whatever. Yeah, that's probably a key point. There are some other, again, sort of tax records, so they might be helpful, but yeah, I would probably start with electoral registers and directories, and then if you can piece together a few snippets of detail, that will hopefully lead you to more research, either by the census or other bits and pieces. Yeah,
brilliant. I think sometimes history is just the best bit is the bits and pieces, and
yeah,
putting the puzzle together. I think that's half the fun.
Yeah, it very much is that. Yeah, loads of different pieces of the puzzle.
Next question from Rachel. I need pointers on researching pre-1841 for our house. Even using the census was difficult. All the cottages in the village are just listed as cottage.
Yeah.
Not helpful.
Yeah.
I managed to find some information using an 1849 tithe map schedule, but do you have any other pointers for me, please?
Right, yes, I was going to suggest the tithe map. That was probably that's quite often the next place to go. So if you've done that, again, I guess some of this you have to go to the archives, so it's a bit tricky. So, but ordinarily, if I would look at, yes, the tithe map, which should also help you, hopefully, just depending on dates and times. But if you can look at the other people nearby on the tithe, because that will help you perhaps decipher the 1841 census. So quite often you have to use other records to sort of understand other records.
Of course.
But yeah, because it's very common actually, especially in the early census records, where entire villages were literally the village, and you've got to try and work out which house is which and who's where and what's going on. And you know, you can use things like the pub. Sometimes the pub's identified, or perhaps the big house, or you know, the manor house or the vicarage. Sometimes they're identified. So if you can find those in other records like the tithe, that will help you decipher. Beyond that, I would look at rate books, as we discussed. I would see what the collection's like in the area. Land tax is another one, which, especially if it's a rural location, but actually the land tax can be useful for now urban areas, but at the time, you know, the tax was still being paid. And that particularly, again, takes you back. Most land tax records go to 1832 because they were being used as a source for the electoral register, actually, or the electoral poll, to prove basically someone had the value of property to make them eligible to vote. But in 1832, that changed, and so so they no longer needed the land tax. So most records go to 1832, sometime a little later. But so if you can at least piece together with the census, the tithe, and then land tax, that should hopefully, you know, again, you're basically looking at people's names rather than an address, because in most of these records, the address isn't given. So that's probably my key. You know, if you can piece all those bits together, hopefully you can find the right people.
Lovely. Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we're into the last 10 minutes. I want to get through as many of these live questions as possible, and then we'll announce our giveaway winner at the end as well. I'm excited for that. Okay, next question. Jennifer is asking, does the book cover houses in Scotland? I'm guessing, Jennifer, you're referring to the new book, A House Through Time, but please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments.
Yeah, sadly we didn't use some examples from Scotland. We started to, but it became a bit complicated, particularly with trying to cover Scotland, Northern Ireland and Ireland, you know, back through history. Obviously some of the records for England also refer to Wales because of their joint history, but yeah, sadly we didn't cover Scotland specifically. We tried. But it didn't kind of make the cut, unfortunately. So maybe that's, you know, the next book we'll try something for that, but sadly not this time.
Maybe next time. Thank you for your question, Jennifer. Kim has a question. She says, which map should I go by? Modern online maps for an old house in London or the 1939 map? The house indicated on both are located at opposite ends of the road and obviously show it as different. Is one more reliable than the other? I think in this instance, we'd have to see the example, Kim. Don't you agree, Melanie?
Yeah, because that sounds a bit peculiar because your house obviously hasn't moved. So, so it should be in the same place. So yeah, maybe we need an example. And it depends on what other map you're using. But yes. Yes, examples. But I would also perhaps suggest Layers of London. It's a new online map function, and that will give you basically the layers are the different layers of maps. So actually, if you choose the location, it will give you all the different maps you can refer to, and so hopefully that might solve that problem, and you might find where your house is, or perhaps a certain map isn't the same details. It just depends. Yeah.
That's a great tip.
Yeah.
Okay, question from Fiona. How do you deal with brick walls? No pun intended.
Well, actually, I've written a blog post about this and it's coming soon. But yes, it can be a challenge. And I think with any kind of historic research, you know, whether it's family history or house history or anything else, there are gaps in the records. There are some brick walls where you just can't find what you're looking for. So I would probably step back and then just try and think of alternative sources to try and back up, or at least provide some further clues as to getting past that brick wall. That's probably the thing. And you might end up searching for a person and actually piecing together more of their story, and you might find details of them in the house in different records. So I did this with a house I researched in London, where actually the people were not in a lot of the official records. They weren't in the electoral register. They weren't in the directories. They were, and they, by this point the census wasn't relevant. But I found them on passenger lists, and actually very, very clearly gave their name and their address. And so that was gold, because it's like, yes, they were there. So sometimes it is just, you know, taking a step back, perhaps looking at some different options, perhaps searching a few different names, perhaps searching neighbours, and that might lead you to different sources or different clues as to the history of your house. So especially for some of the older records where actually the address starts to disappear, and in a lot of cases you might end up researching several houses in a row or in a street, because they're all relevant, but there's no, it's tricky to just do one house, and it is helpful to actually follow the trail of different residents at a few houses, and that will help perhaps piece together more of the story.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, I think I've got a couple more to finish up with. So Daphne says, does anybody know the oldest house in the UK that's still standing?
Oh, I think there's some debate about this, but I believe there's a sort of 12th century, maybe even 11th century sort of manor house. Just trying to think. I did one which is in it's just north of Cambridge, but there's also one I don't remember. I'd have to look up the name. It was featured in, I did a program with Phil Spencer last year. I'm sorry, name drop, but Phil Spencer did a history of Britain in 100 homes, and he refers to actually and visited and went through the history of the house. And it's actually brilliant because it gives you literally, it's like a medieval castle inside, but then it's being added to and added to and added to. But that, I think, is one of the examples. But it's, yeah, I believe it's 11th or 12th century where they can pinpoint a house that has been resided in and is still standing and still occupied.
Wow.
So I hope that helps.
That's an old house.
Yeah, that's a lot of history. Yeah.
Okay. Angela says, my house was built around 1934. I've tried the 1939 register, but I can't see it. Is there anywhere else I can look?
Yeah, this is tricky. Also, with the 1939 register, there are some challenges because there are some records that are redacted because of the privacy regulations. And I found a few examples where the redacted person is the same line the address is written on.
Yeah.
So like, so that's not helpful. So it may be a case that something similar where if you're doing an address search or a map search, it's not coming up because actually it's not visible. So you might look at perhaps neighbours, but for that date, I would look at directories again. The directories for that sort of period are quite good actually. So that would be one place. Again, the electoral registers. They're probably the first two obvious ones, because if you definitely know it was 1934, I mean, it may be a case that it was unoccupied in 1939, but you could at least still find the record. It should still be there, but will be unoccupied on the list.
Of course, yeah.
But yeah, I would head directories and electoral registers, probably best place. Again, and perhaps looking at a few neighbours and seeing if you can then track the neighbours and find them on the 1939 register.
Okay. I hope that helps you, Angela. Okay, we've got a question. Excuse me. Question from Mandy. Do you have any tips for researching land, precious history if your house is fairly new?
Yeah, and this is a common. I had someone else ask a similar question earlier, where their house is 1960s, and you know they know the story, they know the history, and there's not much else to find. But yes, very much you can look at the history of what was on the site before. Again, maps is a great one for this because that will help, particularly perhaps if it was affected by bomb damage. Maybe it was an area that was redeveloped after the war. So if you're looking at a map, you might be able to see straight away that there were rows and rows of houses that were later demolished or destroyed through bombing. But again, it might have been perhaps farmland and a farm, and you end up researching the farm rather than your individual house. So there's loads you can do with that actually, and piecing together the story of what was on the site before. Yeah.
One last question, and it's from our very own Miko, one of our in-house genealogists. He says, hello, is there much of a divergence between tenancy and ownership in rural and urban settings historically?
Ooh, it's a very good point. Actually, because for most of our history, sort of pre-20th century, but even up until, you know, the Second World War in the 50s, most people rented their homes, and actually it's only in more recent years that we've come sort of owner-occupiers. So in a lot of cases, the records will be different for a person who owned the house versus the person who was actually living in it. How that compares to sort of urban and rural, I'm not too sure. I've not found too much of a difference in the sense that actually if I've researched a farmhouse, for example, again, the same rules apply in the sense that the owner was different from the occupant, and that was the same. And it was only really in the sort of 1920s and 30s that, for a start, large landowners were sort of forced to sell off property because of new tax laws. So you often get lots of sales particulars and auction catalogues showing the sale of an enormous landed estate. And that's when perhaps the ownership changed and became owner-occupied. But also that was the time when there was massive expansion in the suburbs, and so you had that very, large metro land, sort of interwar house development, which just spread across the country. And in a lot of cases, they were advertised as owner occupied. And there were lots of, actually, it was one of the best times to buy a house. And there were so many, the sellers were doing everything to sell the houses, and they would often do deals, and they would give you, you know, free washing machines and free cars to buy and come to their, you know, so all sorts of things. But so yeah, but I don't know any statistics about how it differs rural versus urban. As I say, I haven't found it too different, so maybe that's for further study. But yeah, there's definitely a difference between owner and occupier. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Melanie. So I think that's the end of the live questions. My apologies if we've missed any. We are at 5 o'clock now, so I'm conscious that we're into the hour. We do still need to announce our giveaway winner. So we have a copy of Melanie's new book, A House Through Time, to give away. And we had over 250 entries. So thank you to everybody who entered. And in order to enter, we asked you to describe your house in one sentence. So we've pulled this winner completely at random. So our winner is Ira Morgan. Congratulations, Yay. Ira. And she says, our house was built in 1989. Children grew up here, both left with houses of their own. Beautiful memories of us all together.
Oh, nice.
So thank you so much, Ira. I'm going to be dropping you a quick Facebook message just requesting for your postal address, and then we will send your prize, the copy of Melanie's book, to you. Please make sure that you reply to me within 7 days, because if not, what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to draw another winner. Okay. We have had a fantastic session here. I hope you guys have enjoyed it at home. Melanie, is there anything you'd like to say to our viewers before we wrap up?
I don't know. Keep watching the program. Keep, you know, buy the book. You know, but yes, hopefully we might do more of these and get us all talking about house histories more. But yeah, no, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Lovely. Well, we've got a lot of people thanking you in the comments. We've got Chris, got Karen, got Daphne. I really enjoyed the conversation. Robert saying tracing the history of land on your house is just fascinating. Sylvia saying great session. Sue saying I've just ordered all 3 of your books.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Melanie, you have been an incredible guest. Thank you so much for coming on today. Be sure to tune in to A House Through Time on Tuesday if you're in the UK. Remember, you can always catch up on iPlayer if you miss it. And I'm very, very pleased to announce for the first time here today that next Thursday, Alex will have a very special guest in the form of Deborah Sugg-Ryan, Professor Deborah Sugg-Ryan, who's also a researcher on A House Through Time. So make sure that you tune back in next Thursday for that. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in today. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. And I hope you have a lovely, lovely evening. So take care.